The wedding invitation arrived on a humid Tuesday night while I was warming 3 glass bottles in a small saucepan at 2 a.m. Under the elegantly printed address, Julian had written in his unmistakable, sharp cursive, "I hope you finally learned to be happy for other people." Before I could even finish reading the sentence, Lucy, the most spirited of my 11-month-old triplets, spit warm formula straight down the sleeve of my oversized Ohio State sweatshirt. That was how Julian Vance's grand, calculated attempt to shatter my peace began. Not with quiet tears, and certainly not with me collapsing against the kitchen counter in heartbreak. With sour milk soaking into my cuff, I stood in our dimly lit kitchen in Westerville, Ohio, wearing compression socks and plush slippers, while the 3 glass bottles clicked rhythmically against the metal side of the pan. In the adjoining living room, my husband, David, was asleep on the sofa with baby Nora resting peacefully on his chest, her tiny fingers clutching his cotton shirt. June had finally drifted off in her crib after an hour of fussing, while Lucy was currently staring up at the ceiling fan as if it had personally insulted her honor. I knew I should have thrown the cream-colored envelope straight into the recycling bin. But instead, I stood there in the quiet stillness of the night and read his handwritten note 3 full times, feeling a strange, hollow distance from the ghost of the life I had once almost agreed to live. 2 years earlier, Julian Vance had systematically dismantled our 4-year relationship in the cold, concrete parking garage beneath Riverside Methodist Hospital. I was 33 then, and he was 34. We had been engaged for 9 months, reserved a grand ballroom at a historic hotel in Dublin, placed non-refundable deposits with top-tier caterers, and spent our Sunday afternoons driving through wealthy suburbs, looking at homes we could barely afford. Julian talked endlessly about starting a family, insisting he wanted 2 children, a boy first if possible, though he always laughed afterward to make his rigid expectations sound like light-hearted humor. His mother, Judith, did not laugh. She spoke of the Vance family name as if they were European royalty, rather than owners of a successful commercial office furniture business outside Columbus. When my monthly cycles became irregular, I blamed the intense stress of managing a major software transition at work. But after 6 months of trying to conceive without success, I scheduled an evaluation at a local reproductive health clinic. The reproductive endocrinologist was a remarkably calm woman with silver-framed glasses who explained that my ovarian reserve was lower than expected for a woman my age, and that one fallopian tube appeared partially obstructed. "A reduced reserve does not mean pregnancy is impossible," the doctor had said softly. But as we walked to the elevator, Julian seemed to have heard only one word: infertile. By the time we reached his car, he was already speaking as if our future was a bad business investment, casually removing the brass key to my condo from his keyring and dropping it into the cup holder without looking me in the eye. The aftermath of that parking garage farewell was swift, transactional, and devoid of a single drop of empathy. That very evening, Judith Vance arrived at my condo, carrying 2 heavy grocery bags filled with Julian's remaining clothes, phone chargers, and the expensive wool sweater I had given him for Christmas. She remained standing in the doorway, her expression carrying the mild, patronizing annoyance she usually reserved for restaurant servers who brought her salad dressing on the wrong side. "I'm sorry it ended this way, Clara," Judith had said, her voice smooth and devoid of genuine warmth. "Julian has always envisioned a traditional family, and at his age, he cannot afford to spend years hoping a doctor changes her mind." When I tried to explain that the doctor had explicitly stated that pregnancy was still possible through assisted reproductive technology, Judith adjusted her designer handbag and delivered a sentence that burned itself into my memory. A woman who cannot offer a man the family he planned for doesn't have much purpose in his future. She then politely demanded the return of an antique silver cake knife her mother had given us as an early engagement gift. After I closed the door, I collapsed onto the hallway floor beside those grocery bags, listening to the ticking of the kitchen clock in the suffocating silence. My 62-year-old mother, Helen, arrived an hour later with her spare key, carefully lowering her arthritic hip into a dining chair before telling me with gentle humor that if I didn't get up off the floor, she would have to call the fire department to hoist us both up. In the weeks that followed, the social fallout within our mutual circle was ugly in ordinary, predictable ways. Julian immediately canceled our ballroom reservation at the Dublin Hotel, quietly attempting to claim the entirety of our joint deposits for himself. Meanwhile, Judith began telling acquaintances and church members that I had knowingly concealed severe reproductive health issues from Julian until after he proposed. That particular lie finally ignited a cold, protective rage inside me. I pulled bank statements, contract agreements, and email confirmations, proving to the venue vendor precisely which portion of the funds had come from my personal savings account. It took 3 agonizing weeks and a formal letter from a legal counsel, but I reclaimed every single dollar that belonged to me. It wasn't an act of petty revenge. It was simply the very first time in my adult life that I refused to let Julian Vance or his mother dictate what I deserved. 6 weeks after the breakup, the fertility clinic called my office to ask if I had heard from Julian regarding his required follow-up consultation. Because of federal privacy regulations, the nurse could not disclose his specific medical data, but she asked if Julian had completed his full diagnostic panel. When I mentioned that he had claimed his results were completely normal, the nurse paused before quietly suggesting, "You have a legal right to request a complete copy of your own medical chart for your records, Miss Bennett." The following morning, I accessed my patient portal and downloaded the 73-page medical file containing lab values, ultrasound scans, and physician notes. I read through every technical entry twice. Nowhere in those pages did it state that I was sterile. It confirmed a diminished ovarian reserve and recommended discussing IVF options due to my age and minor tubal blockage. But nestled near the bottom of the intake summary was a single, concise sentence in the physician's hand. Partner's comprehensive semen analysis completed under separate patient ID. Results pending direct consultation. I closed my laptop and sat in total silence in my home office. For 6 long weeks, I had walked around carrying the crushing weight of believing my body was solely responsible for destroying our 4-year relationship. Julian had sat beside me in that exam room, listened to the doctor discuss partner testing, and then allowed me and his mother to believe that I was the sole broken element in our partnership. Looking at the timestamp on the physician's note, I realized Julian had known his own diagnostic testing was incomplete when he handed back my condo key in the parking garage. He hadn't fled because he was heartbroken or eager for a family. He had fled because he was terrified of what his own lab results might reveal, and he had eagerly used my medical vulnerability as a convenient shield to protect his own fragile ego. Instead of rushing into an immediate confrontation with Julian, I booked a second opinion at a highly respected reproductive medical center in Cincinnati. Dr. Anita Shah, a compassionate, veteran endocrinologist, reviewed my 73-page medical record with calm, practiced focus before turning toward me. She did not promise easy miracles or paint unrealistic scenarios, explaining that undergoing treatment at 34 required careful hormonal preparation, higher financial investment, and immense emotional resilience. But then she folded her hands over her desk and said something that changed the trajectory of my healing. No medical professional should have ever used your lab values as a definitive sentence against your motherhood, Clara. Difficult? Yes. Impossible? Absolutely not. I sat in my sedan in the clinic parking lot afterward and wept quietly for nearly 20 minutes. Not because she had guaranteed me a baby, but because someone with authority had finally spoken the truth without using it as an emotional weapon. During a required psychological counseling session prior to starting any treatment cycle, the therapist asked a single, penetrating question that caught me off guard. If Julian Vance never learns whether your treatment succeeds, would you still want to pursue this path? The long, uncomfortable silence that followed made me realize that a small, unhealed part of me had been seeking a biological victory to prove my ex-fiancé wrong. Recognizing that truth, I made the conscious decision to pause all medical procedures for 3 months to clear my motives completely. It was during those quiet months of intentional healing that David Reyes walked into my life. I had briefly met David 2 years earlier through a community education initiative connected to my work, knowing him only as a mild-mannered high school assistant principal who carried 2 extra pens in his shirt pocket because students were always borrowing them. Our paths crossed again on a rainy afternoon at a CVS pharmacy on State Street, where we both reached for the very last box of antiseptic wipes on a depleted shelf. "You take them," David said with a warm, self-deprecating smile, stepping back immediately. "You got here first, and working in a public high school has made me accustomed to losing arguments over classroom supplies." I laughed aloud before I could stop myself. He explained he was buying them for his older sister, who was undergoing chemotherapy, while I was buying them for my own home care routine. A month later, we ran into each other again at a local grief support group. David was attending because his wife had passed away from ovarian cancer 3 years prior, while I was there at my therapist's suggestion to process the emotional loss of my long-term engagement. As we walked toward our cars after the meeting, David casually admitted that he still talked to his late wife while navigating heavy traffic on Interstate 270, and I admitted that I still held silent, winning arguments with Julian in the shower. That shared honesty became the quiet foundation of a genuine friendship that gradually blossomed over morning coffees and long weekend walks through Sharon Woods. David never rushed me, nor did he offer hollow compliments when I needed quiet, grounded truth. Our first real disagreement occurred 8 months into our friendship, after I confessed that I was officially scheduling my first round of egg retrieval. We were sitting in his car outside a diner in Worthington, the windows lightly fogged from our warm coffee cups. David stared through the windshield for a long moment before turning to me with gentle earnestness. "Can I ask you something without you getting angry, Clara? Do you truly want to carry a child right now, or do you want Julian to know he was wrong about you?" The question felt like a sudden, insulting blow, causing heat to flush across my face as I accused him of reducing my maternal desires to a petty revenge project. David rubbed his face with both hands, his voice dropping to a soft, pained whisper. "I buried my wife, Clara. I know how precious and fleeting life is, but I cannot build a meaningful future with you if a part of your heart is still trying to win an argument with a ghost." I got out of the car and walked 3 blocks home in the freezing cold. But over the next 2 weeks of silence, I asked myself the hard, uncomfortable questions I had avoided. When I finally called David back, my voice was steady. "I want a child to love, David, not a witness and not a proof." He paused on the line before answering softly. "I was so afraid you wouldn't call back." From that moment on, we moved forward with deliberate, healthy transparency. We attended couples counseling together, discussing financial plans, health risks, guardianship, my mother's mobility needs, and whether we possessed the physical energy to embrace parenthood in our mid-30s. 10 months later, we were married in a quiet, intimate ceremony at the Franklin County Courthouse, surrounded by 11 close family members and friends. followed by a simple lunch at a local diner, where my mother playfully complained that the buttermilk biscuits were slightly dry before eating 2 of them. When we initiated our second IVF cycle under Dr. Shaw's care, one transferred embryo unexpectedly divided, resulting in a rare triplet pregnancy. Dr. Shaw immediately outlined the serious medical management required for a high-risk multifetal pregnancy, emphasizing the possibilities of premature labor, strict bed rest, and extended neonatal intensive care stays. The months that followed were a testament to endurance. By my 32nd week, my feet were deeply swollen, my hands numb from carpal tunnel syndrome, and my blood pressure spiking dangerously. An emergency C-section was performed at Riverside Methodist, the very hospital where Julian had ended our engagement, and our 3 tiny daughters, Maya, Nora, and Lucy, were delivered safely into the world, spending 6 delicate weeks in the NICU before we brought them home. For 4 intense, beautiful months, our lives were measured in 3-hour feeding schedules, oxygen saturation monitors, tiny weight gains, and the overwhelming joy of surviving early parenthood together. I truly believed that the dark shadows of my past could no longer touch the peaceful, chaotic haven we had constructed in our Westerville home. But on a crisp autumn afternoon, 4 months after the triplets arrived, the cream-colored wedding invitation from Julian Vance arrived in our mailbox, complete with his arrogant handwritten postscript. I was preparing to tear the heavy cardstock in half over the kitchen trash can when my phone buzzed on the counter with a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "My name is Hannah Whitmore. I am engaged to marry Julian Vance in 3 weeks. I found an old medical document with your name on it, and I believe he has been lying to both of us. May I please speak with you?" I stood frozen in the kitchen, while baby June slept peacefully across my lap, and Lucy vigorously wrestled with a pacifier she refused to keep in her mouth. David looked over from the dining table, where he was organizing medical bills, silently offering his complete trust without imposing his own judgment. I took a deep, steadying breath, looked down at my sleeping daughter, and typed a single, courageous response. "Where would you like to meet?" 3 days after receiving Hannah's unexpected text, I walked into a quiet Panera Bread in suburban Worthington on a bright Thursday afternoon. Hannah Whitmore was already seated at a small booth in the back, her hands clasped around a paper coffee cup that had long gone cold. She stood up as I approached, then immediately sat back down, as if she had suddenly forgotten how her legs worked. She looked nothing like the cold, competitive rival my anxiety had occasionally conjured over the past 3 weeks. She was 32, dressed in a simple beige cardigan, and her tired eyes revealed a woman carrying a heavy, isolating burden. Resting on the wooden table beside her was a thick, sealed manila envelope. "Thank you for coming, Clara," she said, softly, her voice carrying a fragile, trembling edge. I took a seat across from her, feeling a quiet wave of empathy replace any residual awkwardness. Hannah took a slow breath before looking directly into my eyes. "Julian told me you were obsessed with him, that you would do anything to disrupt our wedding." I offered a gentle, faint smile and replied with unshakable calm. "I'm sorry to disappoint him, Hannah, but I haven't thought about Julian Vance in months. I'm here because you asked for the truth." Without another word, Hannah unsealed the manila envelope and slid a folded paper across the table toward me. It was a certified laboratory document bearing the official letterhead of the very fertility clinic Julian and I had visited 2 years earlier, with Julian's full name printed clearly across the top. "I found this hidden under a stack of old tax files in his desk while we were packing up his apartment," Hannah explained, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The document was a comprehensive semen analysis report, showing severely diminished sperm motility and morphology, a definitive male factor fertility diagnosis that required advanced medical intervention. Hannah looked at me with deep pain in her eyes. When I asked him about starting a family 6 months ago, he insisted we didn't need to test him. He told me I was 32, that time was ticking for women, and forced me to undergo 4 separate blood panels, hormone injections, and painful ultrasounds. Whenever I asked why he wouldn't do a simple diagnostic test, he got angry and accused me of not trusting his masculinity. I reached into my bag, pulled out my own medical records from Dr. Shaw, and placed them side by side with Julian's hidden lab results. I pointed to my official diagnosis, a manageable diminished ovarian reserve that made natural conception difficult, but certainly not impossible, and then opened my phone to display the archived text messages Julian had sent me 2 years ago. Hannah leaned in, reading the cold sentences Julian had written after our breakup. Mom thinks it's better if people believe you hid your health issues. Followed by, no woman wants to marry a man with fertility problems, Clara. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Hannah pulled back, her face draining of all color, as the full sociopathic architecture of Julian's deception became crystal clear. He had not only framed me to protect his fragile ego 11 years ago, he was actively repeating the exact same predatory pattern with Hannah, forcing her to endure unnecessary, painful medical procedures while making her carry the shame of a non-existent fertility problem just to preserve his public image. The morning after my meeting with Hannah, my phone rang with a call from Judith Vance. Her voice drifted through the speaker, coated in the smooth, patronizing charm she reserved for charity luncheons. Clara, dear, I just wanted to ensure you received Julian's wedding invitation. I do hope you'll attend, though I might suggest wearing something in dark navy. Darker colors are so much more forgiving on a woman's figure after a late pregnancy. Wouldn't you agree? The photographer will be taking candid shots, and we want everyone looking their best. It was a petty, calculated attempt to humiliate me, designed to ensure I felt small, frumpish, and defeated while watching her son marry a younger woman. But as I hung up, I received a text from Hannah. He lied to my face again last night when I confronted him with the paperwork. He swore you fabricated those text messages. My father and I are confronting him at the hotel before the ceremony tomorrow. Please, Clara, if you come, stand in the bridal suite with me. I need someone in that room who knows I'm not going insane. On the morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror in a simple, elegant navy wrap dress I had purchased at Macy's, comfortable, dignified, and practical for nursing mothers. My hands trembled as I grabbed my purse, suddenly hit by a wave of self-doubt. I don't think I can do this, David, I whispered, looking at my husband standing in the doorway of our bedroom. David walked over, took my hands in his, and looked into my eyes with profound warmth and quiet strength. We can stay home right now, Clara, he said gently. We can order pizza, play with our daughters, and leave these toxic people in the past forever. He paused, squeezing my fingers softly. But if you are walking into that hotel today, don't do it for revenge. Do it because a young woman is standing alone in a room full of lies, needing a witness to help her choose her own freedom. I'll drive the car, I'll carry the diaper bag, and I will be right beside you every step of the way. With David pushing the double stroller and carrying baby Lucy, our family of 5 pulled into the driveway of the historic Dublin Hotel. The atmosphere inside the opulent marble lobby of the Dublin Hotel shifted the moment our family of 5 stepped through the grand archway. David pushed the double stroller, carrying baby Nora and June, while I carried baby Lucy against my shoulder, her tiny hands clutching my navy dress. Nora was missing one pink sock, June was happily chewing on a crooked pacifier clip, and Lucy was staring curiously at the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. It was a delightfully chaotic, unfiltered portrait of real motherhood, standing in stark contrast to the rigid, artificial elegance of the wedding guests milling around the champagne bar. Across the lobby, Julian Vance stood halfway down the grand staircase in his tailored tuxedo, holding a glass of wine. When his eyes locked onto me, his confident smile instantly vanished, his face draining of all color. Beside him, Judith Vance gripped the golden stair railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Before Julian could process my presence, Hannah Whitmore emerged from the private bridal suite, wearing her silk wedding gown, her face pale but determined. She looked at my 3 daughters, then met my eyes with a quiet, profound nod of gratitude, turning to Julian with a voice that echoed softly across the hushed lobby. "He told me you wouldn't come, Clara." I held her gaze and replied calmly, "He's been wrong about a lot of things, Hannah." Hannah immediately led us, along with Julian, Judith, and her father, Robert Whitmore, a broad-shouldered former Navy officer with a stern, formidable presence, into the privacy of the bridal suite. The moment the heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind us, Julian turned on me with furious, desperate bravado. "What is this absurd spectacle, Clara?" Julian barked, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. "You brought 3 infants to my wedding to make a scene? You fabricated those text messages and doctored those medical records just because you couldn't accept that I moved on with my life." Judith stepped forward, her eyes flashing with venom as she pointed a manicured finger at me. "She's bitter, Robert. Clara has spent 2 years blaming my son for her own biological failure, and now she's trying to ruin my son's happiest day with forged papers." I stood my ground, my posture straight, and my hands resting gently over baby Lucy's back. I did not raise my voice or engage in a screaming match. Instead, I pulled my original red-sealed medical file from my bag, alongside the laboratory report Hannah had found, and laid them flat on the glass coffee table between us. Before Julian could reach for the documents, Robert Whitmore stepped forward, his heavy hand coming down firmly on the table. He picked up both medical files, his sharp blue eyes scanning the certified lab results, the matching timestamps, and the printed diagnostic codes with disciplined, analytical precision. Robert then pulled out his own phone, where Hannah had forwarded the archived text messages Julian had sent me 2 years prior. Messages where Julian explicitly admitted his mother wanted people to believe I was sterile to hide his own medical condition. As Robert read Julian's cold, manipulative words aloud in the quiet room, "No woman wants to marry a man with fertility problems, Clara." Julian's face turned chalk white. "This is out of context, sir!" Julian stammered, sweating profusely under his tuxedo collar. "The clinic made a mistake on 1 sample. It wasn't definitive." Robert looked up from the screen, his expression hardening into absolute steel as he stared directly at Julian. "What context makes it acceptable to let my daughter undergo 6 months of painful, unnecessary medical procedures while you hid your own diagnosis behind an innocent woman's reputation?" Judith frantically attempted to intervene, her polished composure completely dissolving. "Robert, please. We were going to address it after the wedding. There are options, donors, private treatments. There was no need to burden Hannah before the ceremony." Hannah stepped forward, her hands steady as she reached up and unpinned her long lace veil. She did not throw it in anger. She folded it with slow, deliberate precision and placed it quietly on a nearby armchair. She then slid her diamond engagement ring off her finger and placed it directly on top of the folded veil. "I could have walked beside a man facing a difficult medical diagnosis, Julian," Hannah said, her voice dropping to a crystal-clear, unshakable whisper that cut through the room like a razor. "What I cannot do is marry a coward who forces women to carry his shame and fear for him just to protect his public vanity. In that exact heavy silence, baby Lucy suddenly reached out from my arms, grabbed a soft dinner roll from the catering tray on the side table, and threw it with surprising force. The roll landed with a loud, wet splash directly inside Julian's open champagne glass, sending sparkling wine splashing over his crisp white shirt. David swallowed a sudden laugh, coughing into his hand, while a faint, ironic smile flickered across Robert Whitmore's face. Without another word to Julian or his mother, Robert Whitmore opened the door of the bridal suite, walked out to the main microphone stand near the ballroom stage, and picked up the receiver. The room fell into a sudden, breathless hush as 400 wealthy guests turned toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert announced, his commanding voice echoing clearly across the ballroom speaker system. "The wedding between Hannah and Julian Vance is officially canceled due to a fundamental breach of trust and integrity. However, as the dinner has been fully paid for, we invite you all to stay, enjoy the food, and celebrate honesty." A wave of shocked gasps and intense whispering erupted through the crowd. Julian and Judith were escorted out through the side service exit by hotel security to avoid the furious glare of Hannah's family, their social standing effectively obliterated in a single afternoon. Hannah walked over to me, took both of my hands in hers, and squeezed them tightly with tears of relief in her eyes. "Thank you for standing in this room with me, Clara," she whispered softly. "You saved my life." I looked at her with deep warmth, knowing that two women who had once been positioned as rivals by a toxic man had instead become each other's ultimate allies in choosing truth over illusion. When we finally returned to our quiet suburban home in Westerville that evening, I did not feel a grand sense of dramatic triumph or vindictive glee. Instead, an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion washed over me as soon as the front door clicked shut. We moved through the familiar, comforting choreography of our nightly routine, warming formula bottles, changing soft cotton diapers, and tucking 3 sleepy infants into their cribs. Once the house fell into a serene silence, I walked into the dimly lit laundry room, sat down on an overturned plastic bucket beside the humming washing machine, and quietly burst into tears. I didn't cry out of lingering love for Julian Vance or regret for the wedding that had collapsed. That chapter of my life had closed long ago. I wept for the 33-year-old version of myself who had spent months sitting on her apartment floor believing she was broken, useless, and unworthy of a family because a toxic man and his mother had projected their own deep-seated shame onto her. A few minutes later, the laundry room door opened softly, and David walked in without asking questions or offering platitudes. He simply handed me a warm mug of peppermint tea, sat on the floor beside me, and wrapped his arm around my shoulders in quiet, unshakable solidarity. At precisely 10 o'clock that night, my phone illuminated on the kitchen counter with a single text message from Julian Vance. It was the first time he had reached out to me directly in over 2 years, and his words practically vibrated with bitter, unrepentant rage. "You completely destroyed my future, my reputation, and my family standing in this city today, just to prove you could have children." I stood in the quiet kitchen, staring at the glowing screen for a long time. Initially, my instincts urged me to type out a 3-paragraph response detailing every single way he and his mother had wronged me over the past decade. But as I held the phone, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I erased my draft and typed a single, cold, and unyielding sentence. "I didn't destroy your future, Julian. I simply stopped helping you use my dignity to hide from your own reality. Please never contact me or my family again." Before he could type a reply or attempt another manipulation, I blocked his phone number, deleted his contact card, and erased the entire message history from my device. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't second-guess my harshness. Realizing that boundaries always feel like an insult to people who benefited from you having none. In the weeks that followed the canceled wedding, the social dynamics shifted rapidly as the truth rippled through our broader community. Hannah Whitmore officially dissolved her relationship with Julian, retaining a legal representative to recover her financial deposits from the vendors while moving into a quiet apartment closer to her physical therapy practice. Several mutual acquaintances who had once distanced themselves from me during my breakup called to offer tentative, awkward apologies, admitting they had blindly believed Judith's fabricated stories about my health. I accepted their words with polite distance, but I felt no desire to rebuild those severed connections. I realized that true maturity did not require me to hold public seminars explaining my past or petitioning fair-weather friends for understanding. Meanwhile, when a distant relative reached out to convey that Judith Vance was complaining about being kept away from her potential bloodline, my mother, Helen, delivered a razor-sharp response over the phone. Judith didn't care whether those babies were fed, warm, or healthy when Clara was struggling alone. She only cares about them now because they represent a legacy she can no longer claim. Life in our home gradually settled into a wonderfully unremarkable, wholesome rhythm. David's shoulder healed through consistent physical therapy, though my wrists remained perpetually sore from lifting 3 growling infants throughout the day. Our days were filled with the quiet, joyful milestones of early childhood. Maya studied every new face with deep, analytical focus before deciding whether to offer a smile. Nora giggled incessantly at ceiling fans and kitchen cabinets, and Lucy developed an extraordinary habit of throwing whatever object entered her tiny hands: wooden spoons, soft socks, and teething rings, prompting David to joke that she was training for a professional softball career. Of course, our life was not an idealized fairy tale free of middle-aged stress. Unpaid hospital bills still arrived in the mail. Medical appointments for routine developmental checks required complex logistics, and sleep came in fragmented 3-hour blocks. Sometimes David and I argued over trivial domestic details: who forgot to buy formula, whose turn it was to wash the bottles, or whether we had already paid the monthly electric bill. Yet, even in those moments of mundane exhaustion, our home was anchored in an undeniable atmosphere of mutual respect, safety, and deep emotional security. As autumn painted the trees around our neighborhood in brilliant shades of crimson and gold, my mother moved in with us for 6 weeks, following her successful hip replacement surgery. She proudly navigated our hardwood floors with a bright purple rolling walker, which she had decorated with colorful ribbons so the triplets would stop attempting to chew on the rubber tennis balls covering the back legs. One sunny afternoon, I walked into the living room to find my mother slowly racing her walker across the rug while baby Nora squealed with delight from her playmat. "I believe I'm winning, Clara," my mother announced triumphantly. "Against whom, Mom?" I asked with a warm laugh. "Against arthritis and old age, my dear," she replied with a wink. Watching my mother laugh with my daughters while David prepared dinner in the kitchen, I realized that setting firm boundaries against toxic people had not isolated me from the world. It had simply created a safe, sacred space where real love, healing, and genuine happiness could finally flourish. I had locked the door on my painful past, thrown away the key, and stepped fully into the beautiful life I had fought so hard to build. On a warm, sunlit Saturday afternoon in early October, our suburban backyard in Westerville filled with folding lawn chairs, colorful paper lanterns, and more genuine family warmth than I had ever known in my youth. We were celebrating the triplets' first birthday, a milestone that once felt like an impossible, distant dream when I was crying on my apartment floor 2 years earlier.
David was at the grill, flipping hamburgers and laughing with my mother, who was supervising the barbecue setup from her lawn chair like a seasoned general, her purple walker parked safely beside her. Neighbors, close friends, and colleagues from work wandered through the grass, carrying paper plates and admiring 3 healthy, radiant little girls who were happily smearing smash cake frosting across their faces and high chairs. Maya was methodically examining her blue frosting with analytical curiosity before taking a small bite. Nora was laughing, clapping her messy hands, and Lucy had already managed to throw a handful of cake onto the grass, prompting a wave of warm laughter from our guests. Looking out over the yard, I felt an overwhelming wave of quiet fulfillment wash over me, knowing that every single person present was there out of unconditional love, unburdened by social posturing or fake appearances. Later that evening, after our guests had departed and the girls were settled in their cribs, I walked into the quiet kitchen to begin cleaning up. Opening the clutter drawer beside the refrigerator to search for a pair of scissors, my fingers brushed against the cream-colored envelope of Julian's wedding invitation, which I had tucked away weeks ago and completely forgotten about. I pulled it out and unfolded the card under the warm overhead light, my eyes falling on his handwritten postscript one last time. I hope you finally learn to be happy for other people. A soft, peaceful smile touched my lips, not out of bitterness, ironic triumph, or spite, but because I realized he had unwittingly given me the ultimate clarity. My happiness had never depended on witnessing his downfall, nor on receiving an apology he was far too fragile to offer. True happiness was standing in my own sunlit kitchen, listening to the dishwasher hum and hearing David in the adjoining room softly debating with my mother over whether leftover hot dogs counted as a legitimate Sunday breakfast. Without a moment's hesitation or emotional weight, I dropped the envelope straight into the recycling bin, closing the drawer firmly behind it. David walked into the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and noticed the empty space on the counter where the invitation had sat. "Are you sure you're ready to throw that away?" he asked softly, wrapping his arms gently around my waist from behind and resting his chin on my shoulder. I leaned back against his chest, breathing in the comforting, familiar scent of cedar and clean soap, and nodded with absolute certainty. "I don't need reminders of who I used to be or what I had to prove anymore, David," I whispered, placing my hands over his. "My life isn't about looking back at the people who walked away. It's about standing right here with the people who stayed." He smiled, pressing a warm kiss to my temple, and together we stood in the quiet darkness of the kitchen, watching the autumn moon rise over our backyard. There was no lingering ghost of Julian Vance in that room, no shadow of Judith's cruelty, and no residual fear of being deemed less than. The house was filled only with the steady, reassuring presence of 2 adults who had built a sanctuary of truth out of the broken pieces of their pasts. Before going to bed, I walked down the carpeted hallway and stood quietly in the doorway of the girls' bedroom. Bathed in the soft, amber glow of the nightlight were 3 cribs, 3 tiny sets of blankets, and 3 steady, rhythmic breaths echoing through the room. Watching my daughter sleep, I realized that the hardest season of my life had not been a tragic detour or an unfair punishment. It had been the necessary crucible that stripped away my need for external validation. My diminished ovarian reserve had never made me a defective woman, just as Julian's medical diagnosis had never made him inherently evil. What had destroyed our past relationship was his cowardice, his arrogance, and his willingness to sacrifice my dignity to protect his public image. Standing beside my daughter's cribs, I made a silent, sacred promise to Maya, Nora, and Lucy. They would grow up in a home where their worth was never conditional,
where their voices were always honored, and where they would never have to shrink themselves to make a fearful man feel large. Stepping out onto the back porch in the cool autumn night air, I took a deep, peaceful breath, feeling a profound, radiant warmth fill my chest. Looking back at the long, agonizing road that had brought me to 35, from the cold concrete of a hospital parking garage to the warm sanctuary of my own home, I knew with absolute certainty that my story was finally, completely mine. True legacy is never something inherited from toxic institutions or preserved through deceptive appearances. It is something earned through honesty, nurtured with unconditional love, and rebuilt with unyielding integrity. Sometimes healing doesn't begin when the world finally believes your side of the story. It begins when you stop believing the lies that were told about you, lock the door to your past, and step courageously into the beautiful world you built with your own hands. As the cool breeze rustled through the crimson leaves above me, I held David's hand tight, looked up at the starlit Ohio sky, and smiled, knowing that my family was finally completely free.